You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hey, business owners, we know you know the importance of maximizing every dollar. With the Delta SkyMiles Reserve Business American Express card, you can make your expenses work just as hard as you. From afternoon coffee runs to stocking office supplies and even team dinners, you can earn miles on all your business expenses. Plus, you can earn 110,000 bonus miles for a limited time through July 16th. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve Business Card. If you travel, you know. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply. Offer ends 7/16/25.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 220, The Battle About Britain Part 4, The Channel War. This week, a big thank you goes out to John, Paul, and Edward for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com to find out more. Over July and August 1940, on both sides of the English Channel, two different groups of leaders would be working and preparing for the opposite side of the invasion question. The British would be frantically preparing to stop a German invasion by whatever means necessary, while the Germans were trying to determine how to make that invasion happen. While these preparations were underway, a battle would already be taking place, which can reasonably be considered the first phase of the Battle of Britain. This battle would take place over the English Channel and would see many aerial battles and would become known as the Channel Battle or Canal Kampf. Unlike some of the other phases of the battle, which have an exact start and end point, the beginning point for the Channel Battle is a bit more flimsy, but it would extend roughly from the period when the French surrendered until the next phase of the battle would begin on August 8th. This episode will track the action over the Channel during that period, during which the German aircraft would attack the critical artery of Britain, its coastal shipping. In 1940, Britain was a maritime nation, with the most famous outcome of that fact being the Royal Navy. But the maritime bones of British society ran far deeper. Most importantly for our story, a critical part of the British economy was found in the countless numbers of small merchant ships that ran between British coastal ports all around the islands. It was simply the quickest way to move bulk goods like coal around the country. There were railways, of course, but there simply were not enough, and what was there and what crisscrossed the island was under the management of many different railway companies, which made cooperation and coordination difficult at best, which sometimes just meant water transport was easier. The demands of the war would also put further strain on these rail companies, and what could have helped the situation, giving over to central planning and control, was resisted during the early parts of the war. But even if all of that coordination was possible, it did not make up for the fact that the British rails simply were not built to handle the volume of traffic that would be required for some of the critical goods movements, like moving coal to London. The easiest way to get coal to London was instead by loading it on colliers and then shipping them south on water. In peacetime, it worked great. It was perfect. And even at the start of the war, there was no immediate danger. But then the Germans attacked into France, and suddenly the coastal trade, which was so important to the continuation of the British economy, was at risk. These ships and their crews that were suddenly at risk were not doing what could be considered glamorous jobs. The crews of these small merchant ships were poorly paid, they were enduring poor conditions, they had no real job benefits, and suddenly these workers were on the front line of a war. The crews would face danger day after days for months, suffering casualties greater than those suffered by the RAF during the Battle of Britain at the height of the battle in a few months' time. But at the same time that they were being paid poorly, they were carrying war essential goods, and so the trade had to continue. Joining them in that position were also large merchant ships and convoys that were either inbound or outbound from the British Isles to foreign ports. Up until the summer of 1940, the English Channel was still open to these convoys, and they were big and priority targets for the Luftwaffe. To seek out these targets, the Luftwaffe would begin moving Luftflotte 2 and 3 to take up positions on the northern coasts of France and Belgium, starting as soon as the French signed the armistice on June 22nd. The positioning was mostly for later battles to come, but it was also the exact position to put aircraft in to stage attacks on British shipping in the Channel and North Sea. It just kind of worked out like that. The orders to begin these attacks would arrive on July 2nd, when both the Luftflotten would be ordered to begin their attacks on all sea traffic in the Channel. These attacks would not take long to bear fruit, when on July 4th, the convoy OA-178, which was outbound from London to America, was found and attacked. There would be absolute carnage when various Luftwaffe squadrons, including several dive-bombing Stuka squadrons, fell upon the convoy. 4 ships totaling over 15,000 tons were sunk quite quickly, and 8 others were damaged. Critically, the convoy had been unprotected by the Royal Air Force at the time of the attack, and this fact was not well received by Churchill and the War Cabinet. Orders were quickly dispatched that all Channel convoys should have a much greater level of fighter protection at all times, with 6 fighters being seen as the minimum number that had to be on patrol over the convoys at all times during daylight. And then there had to be more fighters ready to reinforce them at the first sight of the Luftwaffe. Some convoys would also be rerouted to the north, and so instead of going through the Channel, they would go north and around Scotland before heading west. But it did not make sense for all shipping to take this detour, at least at this point in the war. And so the demands for protection for all merchant shipping in the Channel was seen as the only way that critical trade could continue. Dowding, at the head of Fighter Command, really disliked the calls for protection of the merchant shipping in the Channel because it caused all kinds of problems for the RAF fighter squadrons. First, due to the proximity to German bases, the alert times for Channel attacks were very short, far too short for British fighters to reach the location from their airfields in time to protect the ships. This meant that the only thing that could be done to protect the Channel convoys was to institute standing patrols, which was literally just fighters flying circuits around Channel convoys. These patrols allowed the British fighters to be on station, but was an incredibly wasteful way for fighters and pilots to spend their days. Long, boring patrols wore away at pilots and aircraft, and it left them vulnerable to German attacks, as the Luftwaffe fighters would always have the initiative in any engagement. Dowding's second main complaint was that there were a lot of ships in the Channel at any given time, and so this meant that British fighters would be thinly spread to protect all of them or most of them. This gave the Germans the ability to concentrate their forces at a given point and overwhelm the RAF fighters at that specific point. When this problem was combined with the requirement for standing patrols, it became very challenging to properly reinforce any specific area of the Channel because so much of the overall fighter strength was already flying patrols over other areas of water. These were all problems, but the idea of standing patrols, like what was required, was also simply against overall RAF strategy. The entire reason that the RAF had invested in infrastructure like the chain home systems, and then Dowding and Fighter Command staff had worked so hard on how to use the information from their radars, well, it's because they had rejected the entire concept of standing patrols as wasteful. But then as soon as the fighting started, they were now being ordered to do the thing that they knew they would not be successful at, largely for political reasons. A similar problem was happening on the German side during the opening weeks of the campaign as well. However, unlike the RAF fighters, which did not want to be tied to convoys, on the German side, they were displeased that the fighters were being so closely tied to German bombers. The Luftwaffe fighters preferred to operate through what they called free hunting fighter sweeps, which was essentially just an offensive patrol of enemy airspace. Then once enemy fighters were found, they would get into attack position and they would attack. This was not really possible during the Channel battle because the RAF was not committing their fighters to random patrols, and they were under strict orders to disengage from any purely fighter-based German patrol. These orders were given because the German fighters were not the primary targets, and so it was better to conserve any RAF fighter strength for German bombers. As the skies became more dangerous for the German bombers, pressure mounted on the German fighters to devote more and more of their resources towards bomber raid support. Many of the Luftwaffe fighter squadron leaders hated this development. For example, one of their leading aces, World War I veteran Theo Osterkamp, believed that the Bf-109 was fundamentally less effective when tied to the slower-moving bomber formations. The various Luftwaffe leaders would discuss amongst themselves how to handle these problems, until on July 21st, at a conference at his home in Carenhall, Goering became involved. Due to the growing losses among the German bomber formations, Goering was in favor of stronger fighter protection for the bomber formations, believing that both Bf-109s and Bf-110s should be detailed to this protective mission. He accepted the idea that perhaps the fighters would be more effective as long as it brought bomber losses under control. As this filtered back to the front, there was actually a good amount of training that had to be done for this to be possible. Many of the less experienced German fighter pilots had to learn how to fly escort missions in the first place, particularly when they were escorting much slower aircraft like the Stuka. It was not a job that they had experience with, and it required different formations and consideration. This push and pull on the German side of how specifically fighters should be used to best support the objectives of the campaign would be an ongoing discussion, and July was just the beginning.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel or that white chocolate mocha. Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, my name is Matt.
And I'm McKinley. We are the father-son team that brings you History Dispatches.
History Dispatches is a short daily history show where we talk about topics from all over the world and all throughout history. We talk about people, places, events, and even objects.
While anything is fair game, we have a soft spot for the weird, the wacky, and the obscure things you may have never even heard of.
Do you have any examples?
How about Wojtek, the bear who rose to the rank of corporal in the Polish army? Or the Great Emu War? Or how about the biggest treasure take in the history of piracy?
That sounds cool, but do you have a story about the head of Oliver Cromwell? Or one about the ancient library of Alexandria? And a story about the first woman to climb Mount Everest would be cool.
Well, we got those as well. Every weekday there's something new and fun.
Sweet. So how do I get this trove of goodness?
All you have to do is go to historydispatches.com or just look for History Dispatches in your favorite podcast app.
So I guess you could say, as the fighting began to ramp up during July, both in the RAF and in the Luftwaffe, the fighter pilots were pretty disappointed with what they were being called upon to do, and they did not like it at all in either case. While the initial orders had been given to the Luftwaffe on July 2nd, and then the first major attacks had taken place on July 4th, many histories put the start of the Channel battle on July 10th. This is mostly due to the actions that took place over a specific Channel convoy with the codename Bread. This was a major convoy, and therefore as soon as it was spotted by the Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, the decision was made to attack it in strength. The convoy was protected by the new standing patrol orders, with 6 Hurricanes of 32 Squadron in place to guard the ships. The Luftwaffe would send 30 Dornier bombers, roughly the same number of Me-110s, and then 20 Me-109s into action over the convoy. This number of aircraft took time to form up for their attacks, and while they were doing so, they were detected by British radar stations, which gave a little bit of additional warning. This allowed 3 additional squadrons to begin to rush in reinforcements into the area, including 16 additional Hurricanes and 8 additional Spitfires. All of these aircraft would race towards the convoy, and the result would be chaos, with over 100 aircraft engaged in a massive running dogfight over the convoy. The 2 air groups were so concerned with one another that only a single merchant ship would be destroyed by the German attack. During the fighting on July 10th, the Luftwaffe would lose 10 aircraft destroyed and 6 more damaged, with only 1 RAF fighter destroyed and 8 damaged during the fighting. This seems like a very good ratio for the RAF, and it was, but it is worth remembering, during this action and many that would follow, the German numbers were often higher due to the destruction of German bombers, which were often far easier to attack than the single-engine fighters. And in the all-important area of single-engine fighters, the RAF had a decisive advantage in the convoy battle of July 10th. They outnumbered the Germans. The success of the RAF fighters over the Bread convoy was balanced against a peripheral action that did not occur over the convoy, but did happen because of the convoy, and that was a bomber command raid by 107 Squadron. The raid would involve 6 Blenheim bombers, and they would launch an attack on an airfield around Amiens that had been used by the Luftwaffe for the attack, and unfortunately for the crews of the British bombers, they were sent in without fighter escort. The weather over France was just bad enough to make accurate bombing challenging, but not bad enough to offer real protection for the bombers. As they entered their attack runs over the airfield, they would be set upon by German flak and fighters, and 5 of the 6 Blenheims would be shot down. When these losses were combined with other bomber command losses from the day, the overall number of aircraft destroyed on both sides was almost equal. The Luftwaffe believed that they came out far ahead though, claiming around 35 total RAF planes shot down. This was not the beginning of the problem, but was a good example of the challenges to come for the Luftwaffe when it came to estimating RAF strength in the months that followed. All they could do was compare the estimated kills with the known RAF strength, and that painted a much more positive picture than was actually the case in reality, and the difference between the impact of those estimates and reality would grow over time. In reality, instead of the 35 total RAF planes shot down that the Germans estimated, only around 10 were actually destroyed, and that's a pretty big difference for just a single day of fighting. Even if they were wrong about the exact number of RAF aircraft they were shooting down, even at this very early stage of the battle, some of the important lessons of the campaign were already being learned on both sides. For the Germans, the most important of these lessons was that daylight bomber raids without protection from Bf-109s were going to be very risky. Along with this, the Bf-110 was not proving to be up to the task of serving as a long-range escort, and was really only capable of protecting the German bombers by making itself a target. And this was because during the early weeks of the campaign, there would be many instances where Bf-110s were on the worst end of aerial battles with British fighters. One of these 110s would be flown by Gerhard Kadav, who flew a mission on July 11th, where 4 Bf-110s were all shot down over England, with only 3 airmen out of 8 surviving. Kadav would arrive safely on the ground, only to of course be captured, like many other German airmen to follow. He would later write about his final action that, quote, "Relying on my 2 cannon and 4 forward-facing guns, I carried out a head-on attack on the first fighter. I pressed all buttons and the bullets flew out like water out of a watering can. Our closing speed was very fast and both of us broke away in order not to collide. Whether I had any success, I don't know, as in the next instant 2 other British fighters were behind me and opened fire. My engine stopped and I knew that getting home was impossible." End quote. When he safely put his damaged aircraft down on the ground, he would attempt to destroy the aircraft by setting it alight. Again, a very common event when a damaged aircraft landed successfully. He would then be shot at by a British soldier who arrived on the scene, with Kadav later saying, quote, "I complained to the officer that it was unfair to shoot us flyers who had been shot down. He said we had been trying to destroy our aircraft, and he had tried to prevent us from doing that. Be glad, he said, that we had not received a bullet in the belly." End quote. The issues with the Bf-110 would continue to mount over the weeks that followed until the Germans were forced to just change how they were using the aircraft entirely. The other important lesson of the campaign, and one that was at least somewhat expected, was that during this campaign, weather was going to play a major role in the frequency and targets of German raids. Determining the exact weather over Britain was one of the challenges that the Germans would have to solve if they wanted to launch raids, and in a time before satellite and powerful weather radars, this often meant manually determining the weather for each day. The primary source of information were weather flights that would be staged almost every morning, with some prediction capabilities also based on U-boats and secret supply ships that were positioned in the Atlantic. These reports were important enough that U-boats were specifically detailed to essentially just sit in the Atlantic to provide daily weather reports due to the understanding that weather systems would move east from over the Atlantic, and so it provided some predictive capabilities. Even during July, the weather would play an important role because after the big dogfight of July 10th, over the next 2 weeks, the overall tempo of the fighting ebbed due to both weather and just luck. When it came to finding naval targets, the Germans were wholly reliant on airborne reconnaissance flights, and even during good weather, these did not always find targets. There would still be some raids, even if maritime targets were not found, often on shore-based installations around port cities in southern and southeast England, and RAF Bomber Command would also be active during the last weeks of July, launching various raids against targets on the continent, but many of these raids were smaller and didn't quite have the political impact that the raids on the convoys would have during the early parts of July. Even if each individual raid was perhaps not as impactful as some of the earlier ones, the German raids during the middle weeks of July, even if they were only somewhat successful, did start having a major impact on British planning. On the 26th of July, a major step had to be taken when the narrowest sections of the English Channel were closed to all daylight merchant ship movements. This was done to try and limit the losses and to reduce the commitment of RAF resources to their protection. Another cause for this order to be given was that over the course of the previous days, RAF reconnaissance flights had spotted and verified that the Germans were installing large artillery pieces in the Calais region. These guns could range the entire channel in this area because it was the narrowest at this location. This put not only the shipping in the channel at risk, but even the nearby Royal Navy base at Dover, which was the base for a group of destroyers that were positioned to protect the surrounding area. These destroyers would actually be removed from this area. They'd be moved to another base. And this was a huge win for the Germans because they were trying to reduce the presence of the Royal Navy in this area because that was a major objective for the preparations for the invasion, as the Royal Navy was the greatest threat to the German operation. Late July was also a period when many other defensive measures were ramped up all over southern Britain as the pace of German raids continued to increase. One of these measures would be the use of barrage balloons, which are one of those actions that were taken that may not have had a huge impact on the fighting initially, but did have a major impact on morale, as the large balloons were cabled to be at least 1,500 meters in altitude and were a very visible symbol of resistance. Almost 1,500 of these barrage balloons would be deployed in various areas with the goal of entangling enemy aircraft in their cables. Within the modern context, I think these barrage balloons sometimes get a bad rap, like they didn't do anything, but they were a real risk for German aircraft during night raids because they couldn't tell where they were. They were far less of a concern for the Germans during daylight raids, of course, where they could just fly around. There were some efforts, actually, to use barrage balloons to protect channel convoys, with the creation of the Maritime Barrage Balloon Flotilla, which tethered the balloons to fishing boats, which I'm sure did nothing to make the boats more agile, but did work. They were able to move the barrage balloons around with the convoys. This flotilla would be slightly less useful in the days after July 26th, when the total traffic through the channel would slowly reduce when it was closed to daylight merchant shipping. There would still be some aerial battles over the channel, particularly around inbound and outbound German bombing raids, which were attacked by British fighters, and then German fighters would get involved, and there would be some good solid fighting. One example of this would be on July 29th, when the Hurricanes of 501 Squadron would intercept some German bombers on their way back from a bombing raid. Flight Lieutenant George Stoney would write about this event, quote, "Then, below me, I saw 3 Junkers tearing for home. They were only about 30 feet above the surface of the water, going away from our shores as fast as they could. I dived and attacked them in turn, and chased them about a dozen miles out to sea. I gave the first one a good burst, and I knew I hit him. When the battle was on, I was surprised because there was no confusion. Everything felt very orderly. Each combat was distinct in itself. things seemed to happen in a nicely rehearsed play. I was astonished to find myself able to be a spectator and a fighter at the same time. From the moment we took off to the moment we landed, exactly 36 minutes elapsed, though I suppose the fight itself did not last more than 5 minutes. After that, we had breakfast. One of my favorite things about first-hand accounts from the war, in all varieties, but it seems to happen a lot with British pilots during the Battle of Britain, is they'll have this lengthy first-hand account of the fighting that happened. They'll talk about getting shot out and shooting down other planes and all the action that happened. And then at the end, they'll just go back totally normal. They'll go back to, afterward, we had breakfast. Even though maybe a few hours, maybe the next day, maybe the same day, he would be up again, fighting more German aircraft. But breakfast. Had to have breakfast. Over the period from July 10th to the 31st, the RAF would lose more total aircraft with 172 losses against 167 for the Germans. These losses included both fighters and bombers on both sides, which for the RAF meant bombing raids over the continent. And as those numbers show, things were quite even during the July fighting, which was a problem for the Luftwaffe because they needed to, at some point in the near future, begin destroying the RAF without destroying themselves in the process. Maybe a good place to end this episode, though, would be to discuss some of those bombing raids that the RAF would launch throughout July and August over the continent. These are not often a focus of histories, but they were an important part of what the RAF was doing during this time. At this point in time, the Air Ministry was dictating to Bomber Command when and where they should be bombing, and then Air Marshal Portal would be given the task of trying to actually get enough bombers over those targets. However, much like the Germans, the British at this point were having difficulties actually achieving what they wanted to with their bombing campaigns. It was much worse for the bombers of Bomber Command, though, because they often had to launch all of their missions at night due to the complete aerial superiority of the Luftwaffe over France and Germany. Night after night, though, this did not prevent the medium bombers of Bomber Command, the Wellingtons, Hamdens, Whitleys, from flying out to hit their targets, primarily in northwest Germany, places like Kiel and Hamburg and Mannheim, and other such targets. Whether or not they were hitting anything is a different conversation. Accuracy was poor, both due to the challenges of navigation and the challenges of dropping bombs on targets. But they would still have an interesting effect, and that was the fact that both Goering and Hitler really did not like the idea that RAF bombers were able to drop bombs over Germany. These attacks would play a major role in the propaganda campaigns within Germany. In a speech a few weeks later, Hitler would mention these attacks, saying, quote, "About 6 weeks ago, Churchill began to fight in the sphere in which he seems to think he is particularly strong, namely the air war against the civilian population, though under the pretense that the targets are important for the war effort." End quote. Now, of course, Hitler did not mention that the actual damage caused by the British attacks and also the civilian casualties were very minimal. That did not fit his narrative. There were things that the Germans could have learned from the British efforts, though, and how hard it might be to truly destroy targets during a strategic bombing campaign, but they did not have time to absorb those lessons. This was because there was a deadline approaching, the launch date for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, an operation that we will discuss the planning for starting next episode, and it's going to be a wild ride.